Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Dodge City. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1876, and Dodge City was still shaking off the dust of its newest railroad expansion. Wagons lined Front Street, church bells tangled with the rattle of poker chips, and a dry wind swept the fairgrounds near the edge of town. It was there, under a patchwork of tents, that two sisters, Clara and Josephine Leary, set up what would become the most visited food stall at that autumn's harvest festival. Locals remembered the Leary sisters as soft-spoken women from Topeka, who arrived that summer on a supply coach. Clara, the elder at 28, carried a small ledger of handwritten recipes. Josephine, younger by 3 years, was described as a face too pale for this sunburned county, according to a September issue of the Dodge City Times. Their stall was modest: smoked meats, cornbread and a stew that travelers swore was the richest west of the river. What began as neighborly curiosity soon became obsession. The sisters worked late into the night, smoke rising long after the fair closed. Children claimed they saw lanterns flickering near the livestock pens. Mr. Henry Dalrymple, the fair's treasurer, later wrote in his affidavit that he heard low weeping or laughing. Could not tell which, from behind the Leary tent past midnight. Early county records described the event as one of Dodge City's more peculiar social moments, something historians later compared to the unrest chronicled in the Dodge City War years later, a mass sign of how tensions could simmer unnoticed beneath a veneer of small-town commerce. Though that later conflict involved gunmen and politics, it showed how Dodge City was already a place where law, morality, and enterprise twisted together in uneasy silence. By the third day of the fair, one of the local butchers, a widower named Alton Beck, disappeared. His stall, directly across from the sisters, stood empty, the counters scrubbed, the knives missing. His wagon was found 2 days later by the river, the reins cut clean. The sheriff dismissed it as a robbery gone wrong, but Mrs. Millicent Gray, who helped the Learys with their washing, told neighbors she saw a man's boots burning in their cook fire that very night. Rumors spread faster than dust storms, yet no evidence surfaced. The Leary sisters smiled, served and packed away their coins as if nothing had happened. Their stew still drew crowds. It would take another disappearance and a nosy deputy before anyone dared to look beneath the ground behind their tent. By the following week, the harvest festival had ended, but the sisters remained. Most vendors packed their wagons and moved on toward Wichita or Abilene. But Clara and Josephine rented a small shack on the outskirts of Dodge City, near the old freight road, where cattle drovers sometimes camped. Sheriff Amos Klein noted their residence in the 1876 property log. 2 women, quiet in manner, self-sufficient, running a kitchen of some enterprise. It was nothing remarkable, except that the sisters' earnings far exceeded what 2 women cooking for ranch hands could make. Autumn deepened into a brittle winter. Snow fell early that year, leaving the prairie half buried under drifts and long shadows. Farmers spoke of livestock going missing. First a few chickens, then a calf, then, disturbingly, a man named Peter Lyle, a surveyor traveling west. He had been seen dining at the Leary shack 2 nights before he vanished. A blacksmith claimed to have sold the sisters a set of heavy iron hooks just days prior. What made the townsfolk uneasy was not only the disappearances, but the manner of the sisters' composure. They were polite, even cheerful whenever questioned. Clara's calmness unsettled Sheriff Klein, who later told a reporter from the Kansas Herald that she looked me straight in the eye, steady as a judge, and asked if we'd like a hot meal. The local physician, Dr. Tobias Venn, mentioned in his private notes, recovered years later by a historian researching the Dodge City War, that he was once invited by Josephine to taste their stew. He described it as unusually savory with an iron tang, and afterward reported a queer heaviness of mind, though he dismissed it as the effects of whiskey and fatigue. When spring returned, Dodge City had grown restless. Travelers came and went, but some did not return eastward. Word spread that the Leary smokehouse had expanded. New timbers and a deep trench dug for drainage were seen behind their cabin. Mr. Lyle's horse was found grazing near the river, saddle empty, reins cut, eerily similar to the butcher's fate months before. A tinker named Samuel Drogue, who repaired their stove, later testified that he saw stains on the floorboards, dark, circular marks that didn't look like stew spillage. When he mentioned it, Clara offered him a fresh loaf of cornbread and asked him kindly not to gossip. That night, according to his widow's statement, Samuel packed his tools and left town without collecting payment. His wagon was discovered overturned outside Spearville 2 days later. By summer of 1877, whispers had spread across the county. Some believed the Learys were harmless widows, victims of slander. Others, especially drovers who passed through at night, told stories of hearing faint cries from behind the smokehouse. One account, written by a schoolteacher named Eliza Brown, described the smell of burning leather and something fouler still. When she tried to tell the sheriff, he advised her to keep her mind on her pupils and not on gossip. In that silence, Dodge City turned its head away, until the night a storm tore open the sisters' yard and exposed what lay buried beneath. The storm that night came in fast from the plains, a sharp wall of wind and sand that tore through Dodge City like a freight train. Roof shingles scattered, tents snapped from their stakes, and lightning rolled so low it rattled the windows of the sheriff's office. By dawn, the town was a wreck of splintered fences and flooded alleys, but at the edge of town where the Leary sisters lived, something else had surfaced. Behind their smokehouse, the earth had split open. The trench they dug for drainage had eroded into a shallow pit, revealing the edge of a wooden box. Neighbors gathered at sunrise, drawn by the strange sight and a smell none could quite place. Sheriff Klein arrived before noon, accompanied by Deputy Warren Pike, a younger man new to the post. Together they pried the box open with a shovel handle. Inside were scraps of burlap, a butcher's apron and bones, some small, some unmistakably human. The sheriff's report, filed that same day, described the remains as indeterminate but likely belonging to more than one individual. It was the first official record of what locals would soon call the Fairground murders. The Leary sisters were gone. Their house was still warm from the stove, food half prepared, a kettle left boiling. On the table sat a ledger, its last entries written in Clara's careful hand. 4 lbs meat, Tuesday. 2 barrels salt. Paid to Drogue $3. There was no mention of where they went, only a final note at the bottom margin, must leave before the thaw. When the Dodge City Times printed the story, it spread like a fever. Some blamed drifters. Others claimed the women were part of a ring of thieves who cooked their victims to hide evidence. The truth was less certain, but no less grim. In the days that followed, more boxes were unearthed near the smokehouse, each packed in lime, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. A constable from nearby Ford County was brought in to assist. He remarked that the pattern of burial reminded him of accounts he'd read in the early 1880s during the Dodge City War, when hidden caches of contraband were buried beneath saloons to evade inspection. The link was circumstantial but eerie, the same precision, the same quiet organization. Witnesses came forward reluctantly. A ranch hand recalled selling the sisters a whole hog worth of offcuts, though they had no livestock of their own. Another said Josephine often asked about the soil, how deep a frost might reach in winter. Sheriff Klein's final statement in the county register read simply, "House vacated. No suspects found. Evidence secured and sent to Topeka. Remaining property seized for public safety." That property, however, would not remain intact for long. Before officials from Topeka arrived, the cabin mysteriously burned to the ground one night. No witnesses, no suspects, only ash, and a lingering scent that the morning rain could not quite wash away. By the summer of 1877, Dodge City had gone silent on the matter. But in the shadows of the fairground stalls, where the sisters once smiled and served their stew, people swore they could still smell smoke when the wind turned east. In the months that followed, Dodge City resumed its usual rhythm, or tried to. The railroad whistled, gamblers filled the saloons, and cattle drives thundered past the outskirts, leaving the locals to their routines. Yet there was a quiet unease that refused to fade. The empty lot where the Leary cabin once stood became a patch of scorched ground, fenced off by the sheriff's order, but often visited by curious children. Sheriff Amos Klein received correspondence from Topeka in early August of 1877. The letter, still preserved in the county archive, confirmed what he already suspected. The remains found behind the smokehouse were indeed human, 3 individuals at minimum. No identification could be made. The bones had been boiled clean. The letter ended with a bureaucratic note: recommend discreet handling to avoid civic alarm. Meanwhile, Clara and Josephine Leary remained unaccounted for. Rewards were posted in neighboring counties, though no credible sightings emerged. A few months later, a saloon keeper in Ellsworth claimed 2 women matching their description had purchased a wagon and supplies, heading south toward Indian Territory. But when a deputy followed the trail, it ended at a flooded creek bed and vanished. It was during this period that Professor Alan T. Hensley, a local historian, who would later contribute to research surrounding the Dodge City War, began collecting testimonies about the sisters. His notes, found decades later in a trunk at the county courthouse, provide the most detailed reconstruction of what little was known. He wrote, "The Leary case demonstrates how Dodge City's lawlessness was not confined to gunfights and saloon disputes. Evil here wore an apron, spoke softly, and charged 5 cents for a bowl of stew." Hensley interviewed ranchers, clergy, and surviving witnesses. One account came from Reverend Paul March, who recalled visiting the sisters a week before the storm. He described Josephine as nervous, distracted, with hands that trembled even at prayer. Clara, he said, refused to meet his eyes. When he asked about the smell around their smokehouse, she replied, "Some things are best left under God's earth, Reverend." By 1878, the case had dissolved into rumor. Newspapers printed speculative columns under titles like Witches of the Western Trail and the Sisters of the Stew. Each retelling stretched the truth a bit further. Some claimed they'd served human flesh. Others insisted they were victims themselves, coerced by a man who vanished along with them. None could be proven. Still, small traces lingered. Sheriff Klein kept their ledger locked in his desk for years, showing it only to select officials. He retired in 1881, and in his final interview with a journalist covering the Dodge City War, he mentioned the sisters again. "Those 2," he said, "didn't need pistols to spill blood. They just needed supper time." His quote was buried on the back page, overlooked amid reports of gunmen and political feuds. But in Dodge City, the memory of the Leary sisters endured quietly, like the faint scent of smoke that sometimes rose from the soil where their cabin once stood. By the early spring of 1878, the Leary case had faded from official record, but not from conversation. In saloons it was told in low voices, often between drinks, as though the mere mention could summon their ghosts. The townspeople treated the memory like a superstition. Don't speak their names after dark, and don't eat meat you didn't see butchered yourself. A drifter named Miles Ketter, who arrived in Dodge that March, would reignite the story. He was a small man, thin from travel, and slept in abandoned barns. One night, after heavy rain, he found shelter near the old Leary lot. The next morning he stumbled into town pale and trembling, swearing he'd seen a hand, small as a woman's, reaching from the earth. Sheriff Klein, though retired by then, was summoned back for consultation. He and Deputy Pike investigated the site, where they discovered a shallow depression freshly disturbed. Beneath a layer of wet soil, they unearthed a piece of fabric, a faded gingham dress sleeve. The pattern matched what Josephine Leary had been last seen wearing. This discovery renewed interest among both townsfolk and travelers. A reporter from the Kansas Herald arrived to cover what he called Dodge City's unfinished meal. His article compared the case to the unresolved feuds and corruption later chronicled in the Dodge City War, remarking that the real violence of the frontier is often not fought with bullets, but with secrets and hunger. As the investigation reopened, new witnesses surfaced. An aging cattleman, Elias Boone, claimed he had once traded with a pair of women, fitting the Leary's description near Medicine Lodge, about 80 miles south. They were selling smoked meat and salt pork out of a wagon. When he asked where they were from, Clara reportedly smiled and said, "From where the soil is kind to us." Sheriff Klein sent word to nearby counties to watch for similar stalls. Within weeks, 2 more were found, one in Caldwell, another near Arkansas City, both abandoned. Each contained signs of hasty departure, ashes still warm, utensils missing, and in one a pair of small spectacles believed to belong to Josephine. Despite the evidence, no one could track them. Stagecoach routes were unreliable, and most travelers didn't question 2 polite women serving hot food along the dusty roads. What unsettled investigators most was how the sisters seemed to stay one step ahead, disappearing days before inquiries arrived, leaving behind just enough to confirm their presence, but nothing to catch them. By autumn, even the law grew weary of pursuit. Funding for the investigation dried up. The trail had gone cold. Still, the townspeople spoke of them whenever a storm rolled in, or a stranger lingered too long at the fairgrounds. A young deputy once remarked, "The Learys might be dead, but their kind of quiet never dies here." And so Dodge City moved on once more, its streets busier, its legends thicker. Yet beneath the sound of boots and brass bands, a silence remained. Those who passed the burned plot swore they sometimes heard faint laughter when the wind came from the south, carrying with it the smell of smoke and something older, harder to name. By 1879, Dodge City was changing. More brick buildings lined Front Street. The saloons had glass windows instead of canvas flaps, and a sense of order, fragile but visible, had begun to take hold. Yet some old shadows refused to die. The Leary sisters' story had turned from gossip to legend, and by then it was said no fairground in western Kansas opened without someone muttering a quiet prayer before tasting stew. The county clerk, a meticulous man named Jonathan Hale, had kept copies of Sheriff Klein's reports. Decades later, these papers became part of the same municipal archive that would preserve letters and depositions from the Dodge City War, connecting the sisters' case to a wider portrait of Dodge's lawless years. Hale's notes mention that he occasionally received unsigned letters, each written in an elegant looping script, containing recipes and instructions for preserving meat in lime. He burned the first few, but by the third he kept one as evidence. The postmark was from Indian Territory. In June of that year, a trader named Wallace Dent stopped by the sheriff's office to sell cattle permits. Over whiskey, he told a story that chilled everyone present. A few months prior, he had crossed paths with two women near the Cimarron River, who sold him smoked beef wrapped in linen. When asked where they were headed, they replied, "South to find peace." Dent said he recognized the elder one's eyes, steady and pale blue, the kind that didn't blink when she smiled. Sheriff Klein, though no longer in office, quietly organized a small posse to verify the claim. They rode for 3 days into the territory, following Dent's description of the route. They found remnants of a campfire and several broken jars filled with coarse salt, but no sign of the sisters. A few yards away, Deputy Pike noticed something half buried in sand. A silver hair comb engraved with the initials CL. The posse returned empty-handed, though the sheriff's private journal, now part of the same archive cited by historians who later studied the Dodge City War, contains one unsettling entry dated July 3rd, 1879. If they live without fear. And if they're dead, I reckon Hell's Kitchen got a new cook. The town gradually abandoned hope of finding them. Yet the food stalls that replaced theirs during the next harvest fair struggled. Customers claimed the meat spoiled quickly or tasted off. One stall owner, Mrs. Weber, told others she woke one night to see two women standing beyond the fence, watching in silence before fading into the dark. Children dared each other to touch the burned soil of the old Leary lot. Some swore their hands came away cold even on summer nights. By the 1880s, people began calling it the Sisters' Ground. No matter how much the city grew or what laws it passed, that patch of land remained barren. Nothing ever sprouted there, not even weeds. Locals said the earth had been salted to keep things from coming back. Others whispered it was the ground itself that refused to forget. By 1880, the Leary case had settled into uneasy folklore, but some men still couldn't let it go. Among them was Deputy Warren Pike, the same young officer who'd first uncovered the pit behind their smokehouse. He'd aged hard in just a few years, thinner, quieter, with eyes that no longer met others when he spoke. His journal, found in the city records decades later, detailed his private search for the sisters. He wrote that he left Dodge City in the spring of 1880, traveling south toward the Red River, after hearing rumors of a widow's camp feeding travelers for a few cents a plate. Pike described arriving at a river crossing where the smell of wood smoke and stew filled the air. Two women sat beside a fire. One wore a bonnet that hid her face. The other stirred a pot with what looked like an iron hook. He asked if they'd seen anyone heading north. The younger woman, her hands trembling slightly, replied, "No one worth remembering." Pike never confirmed it was them, But his entry ended with a haunting line. If those eyes weren't Clara's, then hell's got twins of its own. His account returned by post 6 months later, sent to Sheriff Klein from a station in Guthrie, Indian Territory. Pike himself was never seen again. Around the same time, Dodge City's attention turned elsewhere. The disputes between lawmen and saloon owners that later erupted into the Dodge City War dominated every headline. Talk of the Leary sisters faded beneath the noise of gunfights and politics. Still, the old-timers noticed peculiar details that made them wonder if the two events weren't somehow connected. A fire broke out in a storehouse near Front Street, the same storehouse where bones from the Leary case had been temporarily kept. The blaze destroyed everything, and the fire marshal ruled it accidental, though no cause was found. Years later, Professor Hensley, who'd been collecting records of both the Leary murders and the Dodge City War, wrote in his surviving notes, "The fire that erased evidence of the sisters came the same month. Tensions reached their peak in Dodge. It's as though the town itself sought to cleanse its memory, burning away the quiet sins before turning on the loud ones. By 1881, what few people remembered of the sisters became blurred with other local tragedies. A ranch family poisoned by spoiled meat, a traveler found near the river, clutching a strand of women's hair, a ledger discovered in an abandoned wagon, filled with names and weights written in a precise feminine hand. The ledger was sent to Topeka, but it vanished en route. Only a copy of one page survives in the clerk's notes. Boone, 12 stone. Dent, 9 stone, paid. After that, no one spoke openly of the Learys again. Dodge City was tired of its ghosts, and Kansas itself was changing, its wild years giving way to barbed wire and quiet fields. But the fairground never quite lost its smell of smoke, especially when rain softened the dirt. Old residents said that on stormy nights you could still hear a woman's voice drifting over the wind, calling softly, "Supper's ready." By 1882, the railroad had made Dodge City a crossroads of trade, cattle, and conflict. Strangers poured in by the hundreds, and with them came stories, some true, others born of whiskey and memory. Amid this growing bustle, only a few still remembered the Leary sisters clearly, and even fewer dared to speak their names aloud. But for those who did, the fear remained tangible, a chill that hung in the air like the dust after a cattle stampede. A traveling photographer named Elias Pennington arrived that summer to document the frontier life. He set up his wagon studio near the fairground, ironically, just a few paces from the barren patch once known as the Leary Lot. When his glass plates were later developed, one of them revealed something strange. 2 faint silhouettes behind the stall canvas, both facing the camera. Pennington swore he had been alone that day. The townspeople dismissed it as an exposure error, yet the photograph became a curiosity displayed in the back of the general store, where it drew nervous glances from anyone old enough to remember. The sheriff's successor, Marshal Henry Pruitt, had little interest in ghosts or old crimes. His concerns were practical, keeping the peace amid the rising tensions that would soon ignite the Dodge City War. Still, the name Leary appeared once more in his ledgers when a Kansas Pacific agent reported receiving a crate addressed to Mrs. C. Leary from Indian Territory. Inside was only salt, a butcher's knife, and a letter that read, "For old time's sake." Professor Hensley, by then collecting material for his unfinished book, The Hidden Hunger of the Plains, took note of the incident. He cited it in his field notes, those same notes now quoted in modern summaries of the Dodge City War, as an example of how unresolved crimes often mirror the moral climate of their towns. His reflection was coldly precise. Dodge City did not breed monsters. It merely fed them well and looked away. In the autumn of 1882, a team of railway workers digging a drainage ditch behind Front Street uncovered more bones. At first believed to be from livestock, they were soon identified as human. Their condition suggested they had been boiled, then buried in lime. The discovery reignited whispers that the Leary sisters had never truly left, that they'd blended into the noise of a growing town, hiding behind new names and fresh recipes. A widow named Mrs. Mabel Droge, wife of the vanished tinker Samuel Droger, came forward after the discovery. She claimed that years earlier, she'd received a parcel from an anonymous lady in Topeka, containing a small tin labeled kitchen salt and a folded note. He helped, and we are grateful. The handwriting matched that of the Leary ledger. The marshal dismissed it as coincidence, but the townsfolk didn't. That winter, hardly anyone ate stew at public gatherings. The church stopped hosting evening socials altogether. And when the snow fell that December, it blanketed the fairgrounds smooth and white, except for one narrow strip of earth along the old lot, where the snow refused to settle, melting as soon as it touched the ground. It was as if the land itself remembered. By 1883, Dodge City had become a town in turmoil. The disputes between lawmen and saloon owners, later immortalized as the Dodge City War, consumed every conversation. Gunsmoke replaced gossip, and the city's new sheriff, Charlie Bassett, had more to fear from politics than from ghosts. Yet beneath that chaos, the Leary story refused to die. It clung to the town's conscience like the smell of old grease, never gone, only waiting to be stirred. Professor Alan T. Hensley, still documenting the moral decay that defined those years, made another passing reference to the sisters in his correspondence to the Kansas Historical Society. In one letter he wrote, "While men duel for pride and whiskey, the true corruption of Dodge was quieter, the kind that simmered in kitchens and ledger books." He never named Clara or Josephine directly, but everyone knew who he meant. His remarks were published in a regional pamphlet years later, and it reawakened public interest in the forgotten murders. Around this same time, the Dodge City Times received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page from an old ledger, the same fine handwriting as before, listing only one entry, Pruitt, 11 stone. Marshal Henry Pruitt, then leading peace negotiations during the Dodge City War, laughed it off as a prank. But when he vanished from town weeks later, last seen riding east toward Fort Dodge, the laughter stopped. His horse was found 3 days later with an empty saddle, reins severed clean. Locals whispered that the sisters had returned to finish something left undone. The marshal's replacement ordered a search, but no sign of foul play was found. Still, the eerie coincidence sent ripples through the town. Some claimed to see 2 veiled women at the edge of the fairgrounds after sundown, moving slowly through the dust before disappearing behind the ruined stalls. A merchant named Walter Hume claimed he sold canned goods to 2 ladies who spoke with Eastern accents, just days before the marshal disappeared. They purchased only salt vinegar and several empty jars. When Hume asked if they were from around Dodge, one smiled faintly and said, "We've been here longer than most." Newspapers never printed the connection, but the locals made it themselves. Within months, the Dodge City War reached its tense conclusion, and much of the town's earlier history was quietly buried, literally and figuratively. Old case files went missing. Others were destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1884. Among them, reportedly, were the remaining documents of the Leary investigation. In the aftermath, Professor Hensley left Dodge City altogether. His final lecture at Topeka Academy of Law included one last note on the subject. Some crimes are never solved because the truth refuses to be found. Some towns build themselves atop graves, pretending the earth is just dirt. After that, he was never heard from again. His journals, recovered from an estate sale decades later, still smelled faintly of smoke. By 1885, the Leary story had faded once more into whispers. But in Dodge City, whispers have a way of lasting longer than records. By the spring of 1885, Dodge City was quieter, on the surface. The gunfights that once filled the streets had dwindled, and the lawmen who survived the Dodge City War now carried themselves with weary dignity. But for every saloon rebuilt, another story resurfaced from beneath the dust, and none unsettled the town more than the rumors that the Leary sisters were back among them. The fairgrounds, long abandoned, had been reopened that year for a new civic event, the Western Exposition. Booths and stalls returned, though the city ordered strict inspection of all vendors, especially food sellers. It was meant to symbolize renewal, proof that Dodge City had risen from its darker years. Yet when the first day of the fair arrived, a subtle unease fell over the crowd. A stall near the back corner, unlisted on any vendor sheet, had appeared overnight. It bore a simple sign, Leary's Fair. Inside, 2 women served stew from iron pots, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. The smell drifted thick and sweet across the grounds, and by noon the line stretched halfway down the fence. When a city clerk named George Ulwin approached to verify their license, The elder woman handed him a bowl instead and said, "Taste first. Ask later." He refused and returned an hour later with Marshal Edgar Rowan. By then, the stall was empty. Only the pots remained, still hot to the touch, and a single folded note lay atop the counter. "We never left. You just stopped looking." The event caused a quiet panic. The marshal ordered the area searched, but no trace of the women was found. Some insisted it was a cruel hoax. Others whispered that the sisters had truly returned, drawn by the fair, by the crowds, or by the soil itself that had once hidden their crimes. Professor Hensley's old writings were unearthed again around this time by a Topeka journalist, preparing a feature on the Dodge City War. In one passage, he noted that Dodge's reputation for violence was not born from the pistol but from the plate. The quote spread quickly, and within weeks, papers across Kansas revived interest in the forgotten story of the sisters. Sheriff Rowan, a cautious man and veteran of the post-war peacekeeping force, reopened the investigation in name only, hoping to reassure the public. He found little, just a few accounts from fairgoers describing one of the women as having startlingly blue eyes and a voice as calm as scripture. Later that summer, a farmer plowing near the Arkansas River unearthed a small wooden box sealed with wax. Inside were two items: a woman's locket containing a faded photo of two sisters, and a scrap of paper marked with a single line, "The harvest never ends." The discovery was never reported in official papers, but the local clergy mentioned it in sermons for weeks afterward. Dodge City's fairs continued in the years that followed, though fewer people attended after dark. The town had survived war and lawlessness, but it could never quite cleanse itself of the Leary name. And each year, when the wind carried the scent of smoke and stew over the fairground, the townsfolk swore it felt as if Dodge was remembering something it had promised to forget. By 1886, the Leary legend had taken on a life of its own. Travelers stopping through Dodge City heard a dozen versions of the story, each one slightly different, but all ending the same way, with smoke, missing men, and a stew that no one dared to taste. Local children whispered that the sisters' ghosts still cooked for the hungry dead. The adults, though they laughed at such talk, still crossed themselves when walking past the old fairground at night. Marshal Edgar Rowan, haunted by the mysterious Leary's Fair stall that appeared and vanished the previous year, began keeping a quiet notebook of sightings. The entries were mundane at first: unfamiliar women seen on the outskirts of town, a wagon with no driver parked by the creek, but by late summer, the reports turned stranger. On July 9th, a ranch hand named Luke Torrance claimed to have encountered two women traveling by wagon along the Santa Fe Trail. They offered him a bowl of stew for a coin. When he hesitated, the elder smiled and said, "You've eaten worse on the trail." He took a single spoonful before spitting it out, swearing it had the taste of iron and salt. The women laughed softly, packed their things, and drove away. When Rowan heard the account, he rode to the spot and found only ashes and fragments of pottery. He wrote in his field report, preserved later, in the same archives that document the Dodge City War, that he could not prove who the women were, but noted a distinct odor, like burned leather and vinegar. At the same time, the Kansas Herald printed an interview with Professor Hensley, now an aging recluse in Topeka. Though he had never solved the case, his fascination remained. "The Leary women," he said, "represent a peculiar kind of evil, one that blends domestic grace with utter barbarity. They killed not out of passion but habit." His statement reignited public imagination, drawing journalists and curiosity seekers back to Dodge. The townsfolk hated the attention. Old residents refused interviews, claiming the story was cursed. Reverend March, now grey and nearly blind, gave his final sermon that autumn, saying, "When a town feeds on blood, it grows strong, but it grows crooked. The Lord may forgive, but the ground remembers." That winter, the Arkansas River froze early. Hunters claimed to see two figures crossing it on foot, women in dark coats, moving slow and steady against the wind. When searchers arrived the next morning, they found only tracks that ended midway across the ice. Marshal Rowan filed one last report before resigning in early 1887. His handwriting trembled on the final line. "Every generation buries them again, and every storm digs them back up." After that, no marshal dared to reopen the case. The Leary name was officially struck from the town register, erased from public record. But in private, everyone still knew the story, and every few years someone claimed to smell stew where no fire burned. Even Dodge City's new newspaper editor refused to print the tale, calling it a scar not worth scratching. Yet the fairgrounds remained empty that year. No music, no lanterns, just wind moving through the frames of old stalls sounding almost like laughter. By 1887, Dodge City's skyline of saloons and storefronts had begun to settle into permanence. The wildness that had once defined it was now being replaced by law and business, rail merchants, lawyers, hoteliers. But even as progress crept in, there were some stains no amount of civility could scrub clean. The Leary affair, as Professor Hensley still called it in his correspondence, lingered like a bruise beneath the surface of the town's new reputation. In the spring, the city council proposed turning the old fairgrounds, the infamous site of the sisters' first stall, into a public square. Construction began in April, and workers cleared the land, leveling the soil and hauling away debris. For a brief moment, it seemed Dodge City was ready to bury its ghosts for good. But on the third day of digging, one of the laborers struck something solid. It was a small wooden crate sealed with wax. Inside were several rusted utensils, a cleaver, and a brittle scrap of paper that read simply, "Not yet." The discovery halted construction for a week. Though the marshal dismissed it as a prank, the foreman swore the handwriting matched an old note he'd seen years earlier, back when he helped Sheriff Klein seal the sisters' property. The local paper ran a small story, buried near the back pages, titled, "Curious Relic Found at Old Fairground." Most citizens ignored it, too busy with the city's modern progress, but the older residents whispered that this was the sisters' way of reminding Dodge City that it could not simply pave over the past. That summer, the town hosted a small exhibition on its own history, featuring documents and relics from the Dodge City War. Among the display items was a reproduction of Hensley's 1882 letter about the quiet corruption of the plains. Visitors noted how his writing often blurred the lines between moral decay and physical hunger, suggesting that crimes like the Leary murders were less about madness and more about the frontier's slow starvation of decency. During the exhibition, an elderly widow approached the curator with a peculiar donation, a tin box containing 2 lockets, each engraved with the initials CL and JL. She refused to say where she found them, only muttering, "They were never far, not really." The curator placed them in a display case for one night. By morning, the box was gone. No one saw who took it. Meanwhile, strange events continued to surface. Farmers reported losing livestock. One described finding a calf drained of blood but otherwise untouched. Another swore he saw smoke rising from the old fairground on a moonless night, though no fire was ever found. When the city finally resumed construction on the public square, the builders refused to work after dark. The foreman kept a Bible open on the foundation stone until the last brick was laid. Even then, the plaza remained empty for months. Shops avoided the lot, and children refused to play there. They said the air felt colder, and that if you listened closely you could hear the sound of a knife against a cutting board. Progress may have claimed Dodge City, but the land had not forgotten what had been buried beneath its new cobblestones. By the winter of 1888, Dodge City looked more civilized than ever, the streets swept, the storefronts painted, and a new clock tower standing proudly in the center of town. But beneath that polish, the same old unease pulsed quietly. The fairground, now officially renamed Union Square, drew fewer visitors than hoped. Its silence was unnerving. Even the horses avoided it, veering to the side as if repelled by something unseen. The city's new mayor, Thomas Brigham, ordered a bandstand built there to bring cheer and good music to the citizens. The work began in January. On the second day of digging for the foundation posts, the men unearthed what appeared to be an old cellar door, heavy, iron-bound, and half-rotted. When they pried it open, the smell that rose was so foul that one laborer fainted on the spot. Inside they found broken jars, a small ledger soaked in brine, and what the coroner later described as a bone fragment of human origin, bearing knife marks consistent with butchery. The discovery was quietly suppressed. Only a few officials were told, and the cellar was resealed before sunrise. Still, news slipped out through whispers. By the week's end, every saloon in Dodge buzzed with the same tale. The Learys had built a cellar beneath the fairground, and it had finally given them up. Marshal Rowan, long since retired, returned briefly to oversee the matter. In his notes, the same that would later appear alongside the Dodge City War archives, he wrote, "It is my belief that these sisters dug deep, not only into the earth, but into the town's conscience. Every time we think we've buried them, they rise again in timber and dirt." Among the recovered items was a rusted iron hook, its end curved and worn smooth from use. The local doctor, Dr. Venn's successor, confirmed it was similar to one sold at Beck's Butchery before the 1876 fair, the very place where the first disappearance had occurred. Whether coincidence or curse, it chilled every man in the room. As the snow fell heavier that week, workers refused to continue. They said strange things happened near the site after sunset. Footsteps when no one was there, a faint humming sound, the echo of a woman's laughter in the wind. One man swore he saw two figures standing at the far end of the lot, both holding lanterns that flickered blue like gaslight, though no such lamps were used in town. The mayor grew frustrated. "We're building a city, not chasing ghosts," he told the press. Yet that spring he resigned suddenly, citing ill health after waking one night to find a parcel left on his doorstep, a sealed jar labeled "salted pork" with no return address. That same month, Professor Hensley died in Topeka. Among his papers, found later in his study, was a final note referencing both the Dodge City War and the Leary case. It read, "Some wars are fought in daylight for pride. Others are waged in kitchens in silence for hunger." After his death, the notes were sent back to Dodge City for safekeeping, though curiously, one trunk of materials never arrived. It vanished somewhere along the railway between Topeka and Ford County. And for a brief while it seemed the Learys had followed their old habit, vanishing again just when the light drew close enough to see them. By 1889, the town's leaders finally gave up trying to turn Union Square into a place of celebration. The land refused it. Every attempt at building, bandstand, fountain, even a monument to the pioneers, ended in accident or collapse. Tools went missing, foundations cracked overnight, and laborers quit without explanation. Dodge City's progress moved on around it, leaving the square like a scar at the heart of town, empty and fenced, its soil a reminder that some ground would never settle. It was around this time that Dr. Abigail Venn, daughter of the late Dr. Tobias Venn, arrived from Topeka to catalogue her father's old medical notes. Among them, she found the original report he had written after visiting the Leary sisters in 1876. In neat cursive, he had described their stew as unusually savory, almost metallic. Abigail sent the notes to the Kansas Historical Society, appending her own commentary. My father's handwriting wavered only once in his life, on that page. Her letter, later cited in academic reviews, alongside sources from the Dodge City War, revived interest among scholars who began to treat the Leary case as an early study in rural hysteria and moral decay. But in Dodge City itself, the old fear only stirred again. That autumn, reports began surfacing of livestock going missing from nearby farms. Fences found broken, pens empty, but no tracks, just a trail of lime scattered through the grass. The sheriff at the time, Miles Cawthorn, joked to a reporter that maybe the Leary girls have taken to eating beef now. But a week later, he stopped laughing when a rancher brought in a sealed jar found wedged between fence posts. Inside was a piece of paper scrawled with the words, "Old habits die hardest." No one ever claimed responsibility. Meanwhile, old residents began noticing small details. Women's footprints outside closed shops, utensils gone from kitchens, the faint smell of smoke on windless nights. Some blamed pranksters. Others whispered that the sisters had become something worse, neither alive nor dead, just part of the land they'd once poisoned. In the following winter, Reverend March passed away in his sleep. When townsfolk entered his home to settle his affairs, they found his diary open on the desk. The last entry, written the night before, read, "They are not gone, only changed. I hear them by the river, humming through the fog." That single line circulated quietly among the town elders, enough to convince the mayor to abandon the idea of repurposing Union Square altogether. The land was fenced off once more, declared unsuitable for construction, and so it remained a quiet patch of earth in the middle of an expanding town. The newer generation grew up thinking it was just a vacant lot, unaware that the soil beneath had been turned, salted and sealed for more than a decade. But the old ones knew. They avoided it at dusk, muttering that the ground still cooks when it rains. The Leary sisters had become legend, yes, but in Dodge City, legend had a way of breathing. By 1890, Dodge City had begun to take on the look of a modern prairie town. Street lamps installed, the first telegraph office in full use, and tourists arriving from back east to glimpse what was once the frontier's roughest outpost. Guides spoke proudly of the Dodge City War, recounting how order had triumphed over chaos. But few ever mentioned the Leary sisters, and those who did were quickly hushed by locals who still believed their story wasn't finished. That summer, a photographer named Clarence Doane visited town to document its rebirth. He set his camera on a tripod in Union Square, unaware of its history. The day was bright and windless. He took 3 exposures. When the plates were developed that evening, the first 2 were clear, crisp images of the square's barren field. But the third showed something else. 2 faint shapes standing near the center side by side, one holding what appeared to be a ladle. Doane showed the photo to Marshal Cawthorne, who dismissed it as a double exposure. Yet within weeks, the image made its way into local gossip and eventually to the Kansas Herald, which published it under the headline, "The Cooks of Union Square." The photograph drew curious visitors. Some came with cameras, others with shovels. On the 5th night after the article's release, a group of young men dared each other to dig at the site under moonlight. What they found ended the amusement quickly. Only a few feet down, they struck a wooden crate filled with salt and bone fragments, too small for livestock. The men fled before dawn, and by morning, the hole had been filled again. The mayor ordered guards posted at the lot, but within a week both watchmen resigned, claiming they heard voices whispering beneath the ground. "It wasn't words," one said, "just sounds like knives on stone." Meanwhile, in Topeka, scholars revisiting Professor Hensley's papers noticed recurring references between the Leary murders and the Dodge City War. One margin note read, "Both were born from neglect. Men ignored violence in their streets. Women hid it in their kitchens." The line gained quiet circulation in academic circles, cited as Hensley's reflection on the moral paradox of frontier civilization. But in Dodge City, it felt more like a curse. No matter how modern the town became, its roots would always twist through the dark soil of those unsolved nights. By autumn, a dry wind swept the plains, carrying dust across every porch and alley. Locals said the smell returned again, faint smoke mixed with boiled meat, only near the fairground and only when the wind blew from the south. That October, one of the older residents, Mrs. Weber, who'd once run a food stall beside the Learys at the 1876 fair, fell ill. In her final days, she asked for paper and ink, writing a brief statement for the town clerk. They were never 2. One followed the other into the dark and found no way back. The stew was only the beginning. She died that night, clutching her crucifix. The paper vanished from the clerk's desk before sunrise. And so Dodge City entered the new decade uneasy, outwardly civilized but haunted by something that refused to stay buried. The fairground stayed empty, save for the wind and the memories of what once simmered there after dark. By 1891, time had thinned the line between fact and fable. To newcomers, the story of the Leary sisters was little more than a grim curiosity, told by older residents in low voices when the lamps burned low. But those who had lived through the years of fear, the storms, the disappearances, the smell that clung to the fairgrounds, spoke with a kind of haunted certainty. That spring, the Dodge City Historical Committee planned a centennial exhibit celebrating the town's rise from lawlessness. Among the documents to be displayed were several from the Dodge City War, as well as Sheriff Klein's original ledger and Professor Hensley's surviving notes. One entry in Hensley's cramped script stood out to the curator. "Evil that feeds is never sated. It merely changes its recipe." During the week of preparation, a storage room beneath the courthouse was reopened for the first time in years to retrieve the materials. Inside, workers found boxes of old evidence thought to be long lost in the courthouse fire. Among them lay a rusted pot, a fragment of oilcloth, and a folded note sealed with wax. The writing, faint but legible, read, "Still serving." The sheriff at the time, Robert Lyle, the grandson of the missing surveyor Peter Lyle, insisted the find be sealed and stored again. "We're not digging this up," he told the press. "Some stories need to stay stories." His words were meant to reassure, but they only deepened the town's unease. That same week, a storm tore across the plains, the worst in a decade. Lightning struck near Union Square, setting a stable aflame. When the fire was put out, onlookers swore they saw the shapes of two women in the smoke, standing together before vanishing into the haze. The following morning, workers clearing debris discovered footprints burned into the mud, barefoot, delicate, side by side. The Kansas Herald sent a correspondent to investigate, but no article ever ran. His notes, found later among his belongings, describe nights spent near the fairground. There's a warmth beneath the soil, as though something still cooks down there. When the wind blows right, you can hear the sound of boiling. The mayor ordered the site officially closed to the public, fencing it once again. Signs were posted. "Private property. Do not enter." Yet for all the fear, Dodge City still couldn't resist its ghosts. That winter, a local playhouse staged The Sisters of the Stew, a fictional retelling of the murders. The performance drew packed crowds until, during one show, the lead actress fainted mid-scene. When revived, she claimed she'd felt two hands on my shoulders. Cool and steady. The production was cancelled that night, never performed again. Dr. Abigail Venn, now a respected historian, wrote in her private journal that winter, "The Leary case and the Dodge City War are reflections of the same disease, a hunger that lives beneath civility. The frontier never ended. It just learned to smile. That entry was her last." Within weeks, she resigned her post and left Kansas for good. The people of Dodge City, older now and weary, tried one final time to forget the sisters, but forgetting, they would learn, was never the same as peace. By 1893, Dodge City had grown respectable, at least by outward measure. The rail yards buzzed with commerce, and the sound of piano music drifted from well-lit parlors instead of saloons. But on quiet nights, when the wind came down from the plains, the town still shivered with memory. People didn't speak of the Leary sisters anymore, yet their absence felt heavier than their presence had ever been. That spring, the new sheriff, Jonas Elroy, received an envelope postmarked from Oklahoma Territory. Inside was a clipping from an 1876 Dodge City Times article, the one reporting the first disappearance of the butcher, Alton Beck. Scribbled beneath in unfamiliar ink was a line. He was the first, not the last. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, unmistakably feminine. Elroy traced the envelope through every post office between the territories, but found no sender. The handwriting, compared against the remaining samples of Clara Leary's notes, was an almost perfect match. The implication unsettled even the most skeptical of officials. Had someone preserved her handwriting, or had she herself lived long enough to send it? That same month, a group of railroad engineers working near the Arkansas River unearthed a collection of glass jars buried under a layer of lime. Inside each was something different, buttons, cloth scraps, and in one, what appeared to be a small gold tooth. The jars were sent to the courthouse for cataloging, but within days they vanished from evidence storage. Only one record remains in the sheriff's book, 9 jars, contents indeterminate. Case closed. The incident revived whispers in town, though no one dared speak openly. Yet those who walked past Union Square after sunset claimed the air felt heavier, like the scent of rain before a storm. A few even said they'd seen lantern light flicker beneath the soil, as if something beneath was still moving. In a letter written that summer, Dr. Abigail Venn, now living in Chicago, mentioned the town one final time. "The Leary women have become an emblem of Dodge's denial. I suspect that as long as the city thrives, they will not rest. Evil that is buried with silence has roots deeper than conscience." Her letter was never published, but copies circulated among Kansas historians who studied both the Dodge City War and the forgotten crimes that paralleled it. To them, the Learys were a metaphor. To Dodge City, they were a warning. In October, a traveler passing through town left an entry in a boarding house log. "Stopped in Dodge for stew. Didn't like the taste. He left the next morning without paying, his room empty, bed untouched." The innkeeper, one of the few who still remembered the story's early years, burned the ledger that night. And as autumn deepened, the square grew silent again. No more fairs, no more gatherings. The grass refused to grow even after rain. The wind would shift suddenly near the old boundaries, carrying the scent of wood smoke and salt, faint but certain. Some said it was just memory clinging to the air. Others, older and wiser, said it was the Learys keeping their fire warm. By 1895, Dodge City had grown older, quieter, its chaos worn down by time, its legends yellowing at the edges. The fairgrounds were gone now, paved over with brick and gravel, fenced for public safety. Few remembered exactly what had once stood there, and those who did rarely spoke of it aloud. Yet when night fell and the wind rolled through town from the south, some said the air still carried the faint smell of burnt broth. A traveling writer named Ephraim Judd, researching the aftermath of the Dodge City War, arrived that spring and sought interviews with long-time residents. Most refused, though one elderly woman, the widow of the blacksmith who'd vanished in '76, agreed to speak. She led him to the edge of the old square, now little more than a vacant lot behind a row of warehouses. Her voice trembled as she said, "We paved over it, but we never sanctified it." Judd noted her words carefully, linking them in his journal to the town's broader reputation for unquiet sins. His manuscript, later cited by historians alongside accounts of the Dodge City War, contained the last known reference to the Leary sisters. In his closing chapter he wrote, "Dodge built itself on hunger, for money, for order, for redemption, but every hunger leaves bones somewhere beneath the floorboards." A few weeks after Judd departed, workmen clearing debris near the warehouse uncovered something small lodged between the bricks, a silver spoon. Tarnished and stamped with the initials J.L. the foreman, having heard enough of old stories, tossed it into the river. By morning, the current had carried it away. Over the next years, townspeople forgot the details, remembering only fragments, the fare that ended in whispers, the stew that no one would eat again, and the two women whose names no one dared carve into stone. The city prospered. New faces filled the streets. New voices replaced the old. But whenever the clouds gathered thick over the plains and thunder rolled low across the river, doors were latched early. People stayed home, and sometimes, when lightning flashed against the horizon, a few swore they could see two figures standing in the middle of the old square, side by side, hands folded, watching the town they had once fed. No one ever found proof. No bodies, no descendants, no grave markers. Only that stubborn patch of earth in the center of Dodge City that refused to grow grass, no matter how many times it was tilled. To this day, old residents say that if you pass through after dark, keep your distance from the square. The air there feels warmer, like a kitchen still at work. And when the wind turns east, carrying with it the smell of salt and smoke, you'll know supper's being served again.